All right, so imagine this, you're checking your portfolio, you're having your coffee, and bam, Nvidia stock, it's dipped. Should you freak out? Well, that's what we're going to find out today. You sent over some articles about Nvidia, some pretty interesting stuff, especially with all this AI news coming out. One company in particular, this DeepSeek out of China, they're really making some noise. Investors are definitely paying attention.
And the timing here, it's pretty wild. You've got all this hype around AI companies throwing billions at infrastructure. Then out of nowhere, DeepSeek comes in, trains this really powerful model for a fraction of the cost. I mean, compared to what companies like OpenAI are spending, it's unbelievable. It's really shaking things up.
So yeah, let's break down this DeepSeek situation. They trained their model, it's called R1, for just $6 million. I mean, that's nothing compared to what? Hundreds of millions, even billions other companies are investing. How'd they do that?
Well, they're not exactly cutting corners. This R1 model, it performs incredibly well, and that's what's got everybody talking. Seems like they've had some breakthroughs with their algorithms and how they train these things. They're using computing resources way more efficiently. It's a real game changer.
Okay, so does this mean that NVIDIA's, I don't know, are they done? They're finished? I mean, they've been the top dog in AI hardware, like what, 70 to 95% of the market share for those data center GPUs?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, it's easy to think cheaper models mean less demand for those powerful NVIDIA GPUs. But I think there's more to it. We got to remember, the demand for AI computing power, it's exploding. Even if individual models cost less to train, there's so much AI development going on globally. It could easily make up for any dip NVIDIA might see.
So you're saying even if each model needs less power, the total demand for that power, it's still going up?
Exactly. Think about it this way. If what DeepSeek's doing makes AI easier to get, wouldn't that actually make more people use it? More companies, more researchers, more developers, all needing computing power. That could be really good for NVIDIA in the long run.
Oh, that's a good point. That's kind of like how cheaper smartphones didn't kill the need for good processors. More phones just meant more people using them, more apps, just more demand overall.
Yeah, exactly. And NVIDIA's not just waiting around, they've got this partnership with TSMC, the biggest chip maker in the world. That gives them a huge advantage when it comes to actually making these things. They're ramping up production to meet the demand.
Okay, so you're saying these cheaper models might actually help NVIDIA. That's a twist. But what about their rivals? Aren't companies like AMD and Intel going to try and jump on this?
Competition's always a factor, for sure. But NVIDIA, they've got what we call a moat. Advantages that make it hard for others to catch up, The GPUs, they're made specifically for AI. They've got great software, and they've got those relationships with the big names in AI.
So even if other companies try to barge in, NVIDIA's got a head start.
Right. AMD and Intel are making moves, don't get me wrong, but they're still behind. NVIDIA's technology, it's considered the best. And for companies that are already using their stuff, it's not easy to just switch. It costs a lot.
So we've got DeepSeek shaking things up with these cheaper models, but NVIDIA seems to be in a good spot. But let's get to what everybody wants to know. What does this mean for their stock price? Especially that $200 target everybody's been talking about for 2025.
Well, that's where it gets interesting. You sent some reports with some pretty optimistic financial projections for NVIDIA.
Yeah, some analysts are saying their earnings could jump like crazy, 50%, maybe even more over the next few years. That's huge.
Right. And this is where we got to talk about some financial stuff. But don't worry, I'll keep it simple. Imagine this. If NVIDIA reaches those earnings targets, and if their price-to-earnings ratio, which basically tells you how much investors are willing to pay for each dollar of profit, if that holds steady, that $200 target, it could actually happen.
Hold on. Price-to-earnings ratio. I'm more of an AI guy than a finance guy. Can you explain that a little? What does it actually mean?
Sure. Think of it this way. Let's say a company earns $1 per share. The price-to-earnings ratio tells you how much investors are willing to pay for that $1. A higher ratio usually means they're optimistic about the company's future growth. So for NVIDIA, a high ratio along with strong earnings growth, that could push the stock price up a lot.
Okay, so it's like how much faith investors have in the company to make money, so how much they'll pay for a piece of it.
Exactly. And historically, NVIDIA has had a high price-to-earnings ratio because investors believe they'll keep growing in the long term. So you can see how those earnings predictions, combined with their market position, it paints a pretty good picture for the stock.
Okay, so even with what DeepSeek's doing, that $200 price target, it's still possible.
Definitely possible. But there are always risks. We got to remember that. Geopolitical stuff, changes in regulations, even some new technology nobody sees coming, those could all affect NVIDIA.
Right. Nobody can predict the future perfectly. But based on what we've talked about so far, it seems like NVIDIA is in a pretty good spot to take advantage of the growth of AI, even if things are changing fast.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the bigger picture and why this whole thing is so interesting. This isn't just about stock prices and who's got the biggest market share. It's about the future of AI itself.
Okay, so we've talked about DeepSeek shaking things up, NVIDIA's strengths, and even looked at some of the financial side. But this is where it gets really interesting for me. What if this isn't just about faster, cheaper AI models? What if it's about something much bigger, a fundamental change in how this technology is used and who can use it?
That's the really thought-provoking part, isn't it? What if the cost of developing and using AI keeps going down? We could see what you might call a democratization of this technology.
Democratization. So instead of AI being this thing only big tech companies and research labs can use, it could be for almost anybody.
Exactly. Imagine a world where a small business owner can use AI to look at their sales data, or make their marketing more personalized, or even automate some of their work. Or a student using AI to make a language learning app. The possibilities are incredible.
Wow, that's a pretty exciting idea. But there must be some downsides, right? I mean, AI taking over the world is a pretty common theme in movies.
That's where we need to be careful and thoughtful. The potential benefits are huge, but we can't ignore the challenges. One of the biggest worries is jobs.
Right, if AI can do things that people are doing now, what happens to those jobs? That's something a lot of people are worried about.
It's a real concern, no doubt. But if you look at history, these technological jumps forward, they often create new jobs even as they replace old ones. The key is to adapt and focus on skills that work well with AI instead of trying to compete with it.
So instead of being afraid of AI taking our jobs, we should look at it as a chance to learn new skills and focus on areas where people are better, like creativity or critical thinking, problem solving, stuff like that.
Exactly. AI can handle the boring, repetitive stuff, and that lets people focus on the higher level thinking and coming up with new ideas. It's about working together, not against each other.
Makes sense. But what about bias? I read about how these AI algorithms can actually make existing biases worse, especially if the data they learn from is biased. How do we make sure that, making AI more accessible doesn't make inequality worse?
That's crucial. We have to be really careful about the data used to train these AI models and make sure it includes different viewpoints and experiences. We also need ways to check these models to make sure they're not acting in a biased way.
So it's not enough to just make AI available to everyone. We need to make sure it's developed and used responsibly and ethically.
Absolutely. And that needs researchers, developers, policymakers, and everyday people to work together. We need open discussions about how AI could affect things and clear rules for how to develop it ethically.
Okay, so we've talked about the exciting stuff and the potential problems with making AI more accessible. But let's switch gears for a second and talk about the companies involved. We focus a lot on Nvidia, but you mentioned AMD and Intel are also in the game. Do you think they're a real threat to Nvidia's dominance?
They're definitely worth keeping an eye on. AMD's been doing well in the data center GPU market, and Intel, they've got a ton of resources and a long history of innovation. But like we talked about earlier, NVIDIA has built up a strong position.
All right, they've got that market share, the technology lead, and the partnerships. But those advantages won't last forever, will they?
Nothing lasts forever in tech, that's for sure. That's why NVIDIA needs to keep innovating and adapting if they want to stay on top.
And what about those geopolitical factors you mentioned? Could those hurt NVIDIA's future, even if they keep their tech advantage?
Absolutely. The global landscape is always changing, and those geopolitical tensions, especially between the U.S. and China, they could really affect NVIDIA's supply chain and their sales internationally.
Right, and we can't forget about regulations. Governments are starting to figure out how to deal with AI. And new rules could come out that affect how companies like NVIDIA operate.
It's a complicated situation, constantly evolving. There's no easy way to say what'll happen. But that's what makes this whole deep dive so interesting. We're watching a tech revolution happen right now, and it's affecting everyone, not just businesses and investors.
It's a lot to take in, but it's also really exciting to be talking about this. So we've looked at DeepSeek's disruption, the boom in AI infrastructure, NVIDIA's strengths, and even touched on those financial predictions. But what I really want to dig into is this idea of AI becoming more affordable and accessible, potentially making this technology available to everyone. What opportunities and challenges do you see?
That's the perfect way to lead into the last part of our deep dive. If AI really does become a part of everyday life, what kind of impact do we want it to have on the world? And what does it all mean for you? What opportunities and challenges do you see?
Okay, so we've talked about how DeepSeek is kind of like shaking things up with their more affordable AI,
Yeah.
and how Nvidia seems to be, in a good place to benefit from this growing demand for AI computing power. But you mentioned democratization of AI, and that's where I really want to dig in. What does that actually look like?
Imagine a world where, AI tools aren't just for these big tech companies. They're readily available to uh, small businesses, startups, individual creators, researchers, basically anyone with a good idea.
Okay, so instead of needing tons of money and whole teams of engineers, you're saying AI could become something you could just use.
Think about it like computers, Way back when, only universities and governments had them. But then personal computers came along and everything changed. Suddenly, anybody could use this powerful technology.
So you're saying AI could become the personal computer of our generation. That's a pretty powerful analogy. What kind of impact would that have on, industries beyond tech?
Oh, the possibilities they're mind-blowing, like healthcare, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine AI diagnostic tools becoming so cheap that even small clinics, in rural areas could use them. That could completely change how people access healthcare, especially for communities that don't have a lot of resources.
Right. And what about education? Personalized learning platforms, tailored to each student. That's been a dream for educators forever. Could this finally be possible because of, more accessible AI?
Absolutely. AI could help teachers personalize lesson plans, assess how students are doing, even provide feedback in real time. It could make education more engaging, effective, and inclusive.
And don't forget about creative fields. We're already seeing AI being used for art, music, writing. But what happens when those tools become even more powerful and, everyone can afford them?
It could lead to this explosion of creativity like nothing we've ever seen before. Imagine filmmakers using AI to help with editing, special effects, even writing the script, or musicians using AI to compose and produce, completely new kinds of music.
This is starting to sound like, I don't know, a sci-fi movie, but in a good way. But with all this potential, there got to be some downsides, right? I mean, AI taking over the world, that's like a classic sci-fi trope.
Yeah, that's where we need to be cautious and really think things through. The benefits of making AI widely available are huge, but we can't just ignore the potential problems. One of the biggest concerns is jobs,
Right. If AI can automate tasks that people are doing now, what happens to those jobs? That's a big worry for a lot of people.
It's a valid concern for sure. But history shows us that, as technology advances, it often creates new jobs, even as it replaces old ones. The important thing is to adapt and focus on developing skills that work well with AI, not try to compete with it.
So instead of being afraid of AI, like stealing our jobs, we should see it as a chance to learn new skills and focus on things that humans are good at, like, creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. AI can handle the repetitive, boring tasks, and that frees up humans to, focus on those higher level thinking skills and innovation. It's all about collaboration, not competition.
That makes sense. But what about bias? I read about how these AI algorithms can actually make existing biases worse, especially if the data they're trained on is biased in the first place. How do we make sure that making AI more accessible doesn't make inequality worse?
That's a really important point. We need to be super careful about the data that's used to train these AI models, make sure it represents diverse perspectives and experiences, We also need ways to audit these models to make sure they're not behaving in a biased way.
So it's not enough to just make AI available to everyone. We have to make sure it's developed and used responsibly and ethically.
Exactly. And that takes a collaborative effort. Researchers, developers, policymakers, and just everyday people. We all need to work together. We need to be having these open discussions about how AI could impact things and, clear guidelines for ethical development.
Okay, so we've talked about the exciting stuff and the potential problems with democratizing AI.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the companies involved. We've focused a lot on Nvidia, but you mentioned AMD and Intel are also in the game. Do you think they pose a serious threat to Nvidia's dominance?
Well, they're definitely players to watch, that's for sure. AMD has been making some progress in the data center GPU market, and Intel, they've got a ton of resources and a long history of innovation. But like we discussed earlier, NVIDIA has built a pretty strong position,
Right, they've got that market share, the technology lead, and the partnerships. But those advantages can't last forever, right?
Nothing lasts forever in tech, that's for sure. NVIDIA needs to keep innovating and adapting to stay ahead of the game.
And what about those geopolitical factors you mentioned earlier? Could those impact NVIDIA's future, even if they, maintain their technological edge?
Absolutely. The global landscape is always changing, and, geopolitical tensions, especially between the U.S. and China, those could have a big impact on NVIDIA's supply chain and their international sales.
Right, and we can't forget about regulations. Governments around the world are starting to figure out how to deal with AI. New regulations could come out that affect how companies like NVIDIA operate.
It's a complex and evolving landscape. There's no easy way to predict what the future holds, But that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating, isn't it? We're watching a technological revolution happen right in front of us, and it's affecting everyone, not just businesses and investors.
It's a lot to take in, but it's also really exciting to be part of this conversation. So we've explored DeepSeek's disruption, the AI infrastructure boom, NVIDIA's strengths and weaknesses, and even touched on those financial projections. But what I really want to dig into now is this idea of AI becoming more accessible and affordable, potentially leading to a democratization of this technology. What opportunities and challenges should we be thinking about?
That's a perfect transition to the final part of our deep dive. If AI becomes truly ubiquitous, woven into the fabric of our daily lives, what kind of impact do we want it to have on the world? And what does this all mean for you? What opportunities and challenges do you see?
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground today. DeepSeek's surprisingly affordable AI model, all these massive investments going into AI infrastructure. We talked about NVIDIA's strengths, the potential for competition, and of course we had to look at those interesting financial projections. But I think what's really stuck with us is this idea of AI becoming more accessible, more affordable, and just, more integrated into our lives,
Yeah, it's really the big takeaway, isn't it? We started off wondering if people should be worried about a dip in Nvidia stock, and now we're talking about a future where AI is as common as smartphones.
Exactly. So let's dive into that future. If AI does become this, this ubiquitous force, what are the opportunities and challenges we should be getting ready for?
Well, we've touched on some of the good stuff, More personalized healthcare and education, a burst of creativity, new ways of doing things in industries, from manufacturing to agriculture. But I think it's important to really emphasize how big this change could be. We're not talking about small improvements here. We're talking about entirely new ways of working, learning, interacting with the world around us.
So it's not just AI doing things for us, it's AI changing how we do things ourselves.
Exactly. Think about how the internet changed everything, right? How we get information, how we talk to each other, even how we buy groceries. AI has the potential to be just as big a change, maybe even bigger.
Okay, so on the one hand, we've got these amazing possibilities, but on the other hand, we've got those potential problems we talked about, like people losing jobs, algorithmic bias, the ethical side of letting AI make more and more decisions. How do we deal with all that?
That's the big question, and there's no easy answer. I think a lot of it comes down to education, The more people understand about AI, how it works, what it can't do, its potential for good and bad, the better prepared we'll be to shape how it's developed and used.
So it's not just teaching people how to use AI, it's teaching them how to think about AI.
Exactly. We need to encourage critical thinking and digital literacy when it comes to AI. And this education, it needs to start early, in schools, communities, even at home.
Right, because if we're all going to be living in this AI-powered future, we all need to understand, the basics of how it works and what's at stake. But education alone isn't enough, is it?
Yeah.
We also need to be having those tough conversations about ethics and regulation.
Absolutely. We need clear rules for responsible AI development, ways to deal with bias, and ways to hold companies accountable for what their AI systems do. This is where governments, industry leaders, and ethicists need to work together.
So it's a complex problem that needs a complex solution.
Yeah, exactly. And it's something that needs constant discussion and adaptation as AI keeps evolving. What we decide today might not be the right answer tomorrow, We need to be flexible, willing to change course as we go.
So for you, the listener, as you're thinking about your NVIDIA stock and whether that dip is a reason to worry, remember it's just one part of a much bigger picture. This deep dive has hopefully shown you how complex the AI world is, the incredible potential it has, and the real challenges we got to face.
And at the end of the day, the future of AI, it's not something that's just happening to us. It's something we're all shaping through our choices, our investments, and our conversations.
So keep asking questions, stay informed, and remember that you have a part to play in shaping the future of this amazing technology.
And who knows, maybe one day, thanks to, the democratization of AI, you'll be the one developing the next big AI application that changes the world.
That's what makes all this so exciting. The possibilities really are endless. And that's a wrap on today's deep dive.